thank yous as we get started. First of all, for BHA for having me back. Tricia Miller and Marty Peterson and others who helped me find stuff to use for this. And for people in the community that also provided photographs. Susan Macker sent some stuff that was very helpful, and others as well. And even if they're just telling me stories about their own involvement, it helped me get a sense of what was going on. Before we start, I'll offer my usual disclaimers. I am not a historian. I was a newspaper man as a career. I have written a lot about history, both for the newspaper and afterwards, including 4 books for the Wisconsin Historical Society Press. But I approach it as a newspaper man. I gather the information I can as best I can and tell the story. And second, unlike perhaps most of you or many of you, I never witnessed the Sanatorium. That's the first time I said the wrong way. I certainly was aware of it. When we bought property where we live now on Squamigan Road, we bought it from the man who lives in the doctor's house. At that time, we turned off of Highway 13 onto Sanatorium Road. Before that was changed to Squamigan all the way. So I certainly knew about it, but I never saw the building, and I wish I had. We'll have some time afterwards for people who have better experiences with it, then you can fill in the gaps for those of us who didn't see that. The handsome stone slabs that you see here are from the famous, or infamous if you prefer, Tom's Burned Down Bar on Madeline Island. Of course, we're not here today to dwell on the origin of that popular island destination, though perhaps someday Tom's Burned Down Bar would be worth a longer look. But the bar tops in this photo are relevant because before they found a noble new purpose in the beer business, they were for more than 50 years bathroom stall dividers at Bayfield's Pureair Sanitorium. Tom traded them for someone who had hidden them in the woods and wound up not even buying them because he just gave the guy a tab at the bar and worked it out. So they went from a torn down tuberculosis refuge in Bayfield to a burned down bar on Madeline Island, but they are survivors. And these bar tops are not the only recycled relics of the sand around Bayfield. When the addition was built on Mary Rice's house some years ago, much of the material had been salvaged from the sand. And pieces of the brownstone facade can be found around town. On the site where the Hanson facility long stood on the Lake Superior shoreline, about 2 miles south of Bayfield, there is now little evidence of the facility and its mission, except for the one-time superintendent's house, which is now a private residence, and the 50-foot steel water tower, mostly hidden in the woods, minus its wooden bucket. Instead of a 64-bed institution to combat a feared and often fatal disease, there are only condos and sailboats. But the important thing is, like the bar tops, the story of Pureair Sanatorium, which is ultimately the story of tuberculosis patients, medical officials, employees, and of Bayfield and the Squamigan region itself, over more than a half-century survived. And that is what we are here to look at today. So how did a tuberculosis hospital come to be built on the outside of a very small town on the northern rim of Wisconsin? We start with the TB itself. TB is an infectious bacterial disease primarily affecting the lungs. It was spread through the air when people with active TB cough, sneeze, or talk. TB has worn other names through the years, consumption and the Great White Plague among them. But in short, it was a highly communicative disease that raged the world for centuries. There were Egyptian wall paintings that depicted images of TB-affected mummies, and written descriptions of TB in India date to 700 BC. Hippocrates himself described the disease with a name that meant to melt or to waste away. In Europe, TB reached their peak in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And about the turn of the 19th century, the death rate worldwide was estimated at some 7 million people a year, with 50 million people openly infected. For many who lived in crowded city conditions, with questionable at best hygiene, the question was never TB or not TB, because without any truly effective means of treatment, the spread was pretty much inevitable and effective treatments were elusive. Then in the late 1800s, a new approach to treating TB began to be explored. There was actually movement on 2 fronts. State and local tuberculosis organizations led social movement to improve sanitary conditions through anti-spitting laws, for example, and other health regulations, including the encouraging consumptives, as they were known, to seek medical treatment. At the same time, state and local officials began to create a network of hospitals that would isolate consumptive patients from the larger population in an effort to contain infections from spreading. Thus was born the Sanatorium, which grew out of a German doctor's theory or observation that country people were less prone to contracting TB than those who lived in crowded communities. He advocated isolation and open air. In his case, it was pure mountain air, and proper nutrition to boost patients' immune systems. And when patients eagerly embraced that approach, the practice spread. More sanatoria, if I may drop a little of my high school seminary Latin on you, were open throughout the world. The first sanatorium, and by the way, many use sanatorium and sanitarium interchangeably, but we're really speaking of sanatorium here, was built in the Adirondacks north of New York by a young physician who was himself a TB survivor. In Wisconsin, the push for tuberculosis treatment was driven by medical groups like the Tuberculosis Commission of the Medical Society of Wisconsin, and strongly supported by newspaper articles and editorials that favored state intervention. TB, after all, was the leading cause of death at the turn of the 20th century, so it was no surprise that Governor La Follette in the legislature in 1905 called for establishing a state-run sanatorium and approved funds to build the facility west of Milwaukee in Wales. And that facility was called State San. Local communities across the state followed suit. In northern Wisconsin, the strongest advocate for a sanatorium was Ashland physician Matthew Stewart Hosmer from the Ashland Hospital. He strongly believed in the necessity for isolating patients, and given the ever-rising caseloads of TB in the Chequamegon region, he called for construction of a local sanatorium. Treating patients locally, even in isolated conditions, was better than sending them away for long distances to take the cure, as they called it, because many grew homesick before treatment was completed, meaning they too often returned home uncured and prone to spreading the infection. Recognizing that no county up here was big enough to support and build such a facility, cooperation was needed. And despite strong opposition, Hosmer finally managed to persuade the county boards of Ashland, Bayfield, and Iron counties to create what became Tri-County Sanatorium, also known as Pureair, or more simply, the SAM. This was in 1918, a time of great expansion in the number of such facilities nationwide. In 1904, there were just over 100 sanatoriums with a capacity for 8,000 patients. But soon hundreds more facilities were built and bed capacity soared into the hundreds of thousands. It was also instructive to note that this would be about the same time as the great flu epidemic of 1918. So it's likely that public health initiatives were a little bit higher on the public agenda. Locally, a committee was assigned to find a building site. And after a search of the three officials from 3 counties agreed, there was no better site than the 70-acre property south of Bayfield on the shore of Lake Superior. Whatever sacrifices and suffering awaited TB patients, they would at least be rewarded in fresh air, pure water, and lakeside scenery. It also helped that the railroad connecting Ashland and Bayfield passed through the property several times each day. Ashland County approved a bond issue of $35,800. Bayfield County ponied up $41,627, and Iron County $23,700. So the budget was just over $110,000 for land, construction, and equipment. The initial structure included 32 patient rooms and boasted a handsome exterior done in light brick, brownstone trim on the first floor, and a red tile roof, along with a separate power plant, also in white brick. On May 19, 1920, the building was largely completed and accepted by the building committee. And on July 20th of that year, the first patient was admitted, an Ashland man named John Rodkowitz, whose treatment lasted into the following November. By the end of 1920, 39 patients had been admitted, 10 of whom had died of their disease. And that was no surprise, really, because some of the earlier cases would have been more severe before they began to get treatment. And tuberculosis was a major health menace in the region at that time. When Pureair Sanatorium was later nominated for the National Register of Historic Places, the nomination noted that such a facility was of great importance given that Ashland, Bayfield, and Iron counties had a high incidence of the disease, resulting from poor sanitation, healthcare, and nutrition in the region. It said consumption was widespread among the Chippewas on the Bad River Reservation in Ashland County and the Red Cliff Reservation in Bayfield County. Tuberculosis was also a major killer of iron miners on the Pinocchio and Gogebic Ranges in Iron County, referred to locally as the Black Belt. At the same time, more soldiers were coming home from World War I, suffering from TB. So Pureair quickly filled up. That patient numbers reached capacity so quickly suggested more beds would be needed. So already by 1921, the building committee agreed on a 32-bed addition to the still new facility, along with room for recreation, staff dining hall, additional rooms for employees, and storage space. The counties again were assessed appropriately. As for operational costs, each county was charged according to the number of patient days that their residents used the facility. Although admissions were not strictly limited to the 3 counties, some came from farther away, even from other states. It exists only in photos now, and in the memories of those of a certain age, but the SAN was an imposing structure, built well and furnished with small, similar patient rooms, but also had nice architectural features. In addition to the locally quarried brownstone veneer on the first floor exterior, all window openings had brownstone sills. The grounds were beautifully cared and maintained, and the larger community seemed to take great pride when, in 1921, the State Board of Control inspection called the SAN state-of-the-art and the best sanatorium in the state. The staff included the doctor, the superintendent, a superintendent of nurses, and a staff of 7 nurses at most times, cooks, a building engineer, secretary, and laundry staff. Many, of course, were local residents, some of whom worked at the sanatorium for many years. In 1927, a 3-story house was built to accommodate the nursing staff, which also included rotating crews of nursing students from St. Joseph's School of Nursing in Ashland who came for training in infectious diseases. The SAN was something of a farm-to-table place before the term existed. Local firms were favored as suppliers, so Booth Fisheries provided ice for the sanatorium until it got its own refrigeration systems. And dairy and farm produce was bid and contracted out to local farmers. Community groups pitched in as well. In 1925, a much-needed X-ray machine was donated by women's clubs of the 3 counties. In 1930, the Elks Lodge donated a pool table for the rec room. And in 1938, 2 movie projectors were donated by the American Legion, so patients would have entertainment choices. Male patients were housed on one floor, usually 2 to a room, and female patients on another. To keep TB from spreading, visitors and staff were required to wear protective gowns, heads and hair covers, and masks. And to underscore the fresh air approach to treatment, patients often slept with the windows open. Even during northern Wisconsin's often harsh winters, they were covered with stacks of blankets to keep them warm. On average, patients stayed for 6 months to a year, though some more severe cases required much longer stays. Again, not all patients survived TB. I have a friend, Mark Buer, who has a place out past Red Cliff, and had it for many years with his family. And he remembers one summer they were blowing up fireworks on the 4th of July, and his uncle had one that blew off in his hand. So they wrapped his bloody hand in a towel and took him to the SAN to get treatment. And Doc Telford at the time came out of the hospital, looked at it in the car and said, no, you need to get to a hospital. But it wasn't going to be his hospital, because that was for TB patients. So what was life like for those early patients? Early on, bed rest was prescribed, but depending on the severity of their infections, patients also had access to radios and later television, which quickly supplanted interest in movies, a piano donated by our local organization, a full menu of craft activities, and an occupational therapist whose mission was to get patients involved in things more therapeutic than sad introspection. One annual report noted that if it were not for this occupational therapist, many of the patients would become homesick and leave the sanatorium before their care was completed, resulting in their premature death or the necessity of returning for a more prolonged stay. The therapists worked to get patients involved in making toys or knitting or crocheting, birdhouse construction, and whatever else often bored residents would keep busy and occupied in order to relax both physically and mentally. It's pretty hard to do this when one has nothing to do but lie or sit or think of such conditions and the necessity of being away from one's home and family, the report noted. About this time, the occupational therapist comes along and interests the patients in one of the crafts, gets him started in making something, maybe a basket or a scarf, and before he knows it, he becomes so interested that when the dinner bell rings, he wonders where the morning has slipped away to. Of course, that was an even bigger challenge whose treatment lasted for longer than a year. I played golf with a guy in Bayfield whose mother worked as a nurse in North Dakota, and she contracted TB from one of her patients, and he said she was in a sanatorium for 7 long years before she was deemed cured. After he moved to Bayfield, this was in her 20s, so it's a good part of her early life. After he moved to Bayfield for work, his mother came to visit, and in a true busman's holiday way, he took her out to the sand to see what it was like, and she said it was exactly what she had experienced in North Dakota. Efforts to keep down TB numbers weren't confined only to the sand. Doctors from the sand provided chest clinics throughout the 3 counties, conducted outpatient screening clinics, and set up screening programs at local schools and town halls. In April of 1947, some 10,000 x-rays were performed at special clinics, thanks to ward captains and house-to-house visits that attempted to get every citizen tested. The 1930s were hard on the sand, as with every place else. Budgets were cut and salaries were reduced during the height of the Depression, even as the sand continued to operate at full capacity. Salary cuts lasted until 1937, when pay raises were finally allowed again. As for the patients, one longtime nurse, Denny Edwards, later told in an interview that patients, by necessity, formed their own little society. There wasn't a whole lot for them to do, so they had to make their own fun. A lot of them became close friends. They spent a lot of their day resting, maybe reading. They would play cards, listen to the radio, play pool, visit, read the paper to keep up on the outside world. And during the warm weather months, they could go out and walk around the grounds. She said there were not a lot of visitors because for many the distance to family homes was prohibitive. But there were regular visits by community groups offering music and other forms of entertainment. Ray Cahill, the Bayfield barber, would come regularly to cut hair, and church services were offered regularly for both Protestants and Catholics. But the basic regimen was bed rest, nutritious meals, and a lot of fresh air. Danny Edwards later said they may have overdone the fresh air bit. We had the windows wide open during the winter months and would pile blankets on the patients to keep them warm. We would also place electric bed heaters under the blankets at the foot of the bed. And on winter mornings, they often had to sweep up the snow that had drifted in through open windows. Another glimpse into patients' life can be found in a series of wonderful monthly newsletters that I found in the archives here that were produced by the patients themselves. In these newsletters, the doctors at the SAM, especially for many years, Dr. L.W. Moody, would offer updates on research into the epidemic, the latest treatments, and offer tips on how patients should behave during home visits when they were allowed them. They were advised to maintain good sanitary practices, such as requiring individual towels and washcloths for each family member, and washing the sink out after each use. It noted that it might seem as if you had returned to normal life, but doubt will ever be present. You look at your loved ones, and just for a panic minute, wonder if you are really safe to be around. There is a nagging fear. That is when you have to remember your training and have respect for the tuberculosis bacillus. And as one newsletter admonished, handkerchiefs are an abomination and should never be allowed in the house, except as tokens of some well-meaning person's affection. At least they should never be used to wipe the mouth or nose and then be kept around to pass germs on to others. Nothing could be worse chore than struggling with a washtub of slimy, mucus-laden linen. If you should cough, and we all do it at one time or another, the advice continued, remember your sanatorium training. Catch all the bugs you can and put them where they can do no harm. Cover your mouth and teach the other members of your family to do likewise. But the newsletters, which were called Northern Lights, were not always preachy. Each edition included introductions of new patients, often in rather granular detail. One newsletter introduced Edwin Johnson, who was born and raised in Bayfield, Wisconsin. He is 38 years old and single. He has dark brown hair, blue eyes, weighs 140 pounds, and stands 6 feet tall. He is a machinist by trade and also has done some commercial fishing. Ed likes just about everything to eat, and he said that one of his hobbies now is to try and get out of bed and stay out. Poor Ed, it seemed, had earlier spent time in the Sanatorium in California. There was also Ted Flink, 5 foot 8 inches and 236 pounds. Elizabeth Kelly from Ashland, who stands 5'2" and tips the scales at approximately 110 pounds. Myrtle Larson from Minneapolis was 5'9" and weighed 138 pounds, and a charming lady. Mrs. Ferris Leto, who is 43 years old, has brown eyes, stands 5'9", and like most women, has asked not to reveal her age, her weight, rather. Myrtle Larson apparently didn't know that such discretion was an option. There were also correspondents from each floor who provided updates on residents' activities. One noted that Grandma Schultz in room 240 was doing a bit of crocheting. Minnie Olson, her roommate, is a very good cure taker and doing an awful lot of letter writing since she's entered the SAN. An update on Eva Eno noted that she had a new roommate since her last one. Judy Schließ had been discharged and sent off with a farewell party. We all wish Judy the best of luck and happiness after her long separation from the outside. George Nelson was reported to be in the wagon business, after which he would turn to wheelbarrows, and readers were advised that if you see Ray Curtis staggering around as if he is blind, don't be surprised, as he is. And there were jokes in every issue. Jokes like, I was so cold last night I couldn't sleep. And did your teeth chatter? I don't know, we don't sleep together. There were doctor jokes too, appropriately. Doctor, the best thing for you to do is to give up drinking and smoking, get up early every morning, and go to bed early every night. Cully, somehow, doctor, I don't deserve the best. What's the second best? Some of the sentiment expressed in Northern Lights was not a joke at all, however. In September 1943, the newsletter announced the upcoming 8th annual homecoming at Pureair that would bring together patients, ex-patients, families, and friends. For the patient, it is an inspiration to see all the people who have recovered from tuberculosis and who are now able to come home and live a normal life, it said. To the ex-patient, it means a feeling of pride. It also brings back memories of the time spent here. So that was life inside the SAN. But in the world outside, as time went on, there were a number of developments that would not only affect the SAN and similar institutions, but ultimately render them obsolete. The extensive screening programs championed by Dr. Moody and others helped to increase early detection of TB, and in turn reduce the number of deaths from the disease. These photos were taken by a young woman named Carrie Nowitzki, who used to spend summers in Bayfield, and she would, her father had a sailboat at Port Superior, and so when her father and brother were out on the water, she and her sister would walk up the railroad tracks and get into the SAN after it had been, abandoned, in whatever way they could, and roam around. And she really became attached to the place. She took a lot of photographs, and we found some of them online. So Tony contacted her, and she not only allowed us to use them, but has donated them now to the BHA archives. At the same time, years of research finally began to pay off in the 1940s and 50s with the development of new antibiotics that shortened the time of treatment for patients with TB from 6 months to only a few weeks. The first was streptomycin in the 1940s, and another in 1951 proved many times more effective. Now patients could get treated on an outpatient basis instead of moving into facilities like Pureair. So it wasn't long before the SAN began operating below capacity, even as it added outpatient care to its job description. By 1954, the SAN began taking on cardiac non-TB patients, but within a short time, officials began debating the long-term future of the facility. In 1955, bed capacity was reduced to 60. That same year, there was talk that Pureair could be converted to a rest home by consolidating the remaining TB patients to the Middle River Sanatorium in Douglas County, but that never came to be. There was also discussion of using empty beds for the welfare department, But the decision was made to continue Pureair as a diagnostic center for pulmonary diseases like TB. While it was not cheap to operate the SAN, officials thought it more economical than sending patients long distances to other facilities. Still, consideration of possible new uses, including as a mental health institution, continued into the 1960s, even as state-mandated repairs to the nurses' quarters posed big financial challenges. In 1964, officials were notified they'd have to increase salaries greatly to comply with state law, which added to the pressure. By September of that year, officials voted to remain purely TB for one more year before considering dual purposes if patient load continues to decline. It did. But with fewer patients, the SAN was operating well below capacity and costs were not going down. By 1975, after 55 years, Pureair Sanatorium was officially closed. It was estimated it would cost about $90,000 a year to maintain the building and the grounds, but the intent was to get it back on the tax rolls. It was, after all, a multi-building campus on nearly 80 acres and boasted 4,000 feet of Lake Superior shoreline. It was the same story across the country. Sanatoriums were suddenly white elephants, largely without purpose, usually located away from population centers and costly to maintain. The state's first sanatorium near Wales later became the Ethan Allen Home for Boys. Some were torn down. Some were converted to senior housing or used in other kinds of medical facilities. Some remaining stand today, not always intact after so long sitting empty, and more than a few have gained a reputation for paranormal activity. The Waverly Hills Tuberculosis Sanatorium outside of Louisville, Kentucky became something of a tourist attraction, with the local historical society raising funds for maintenance and preservation by hosting ghost tours and ghost haunts. A few others were turned into museums that highlighted their role in fighting TB. The SAN was not so repurposed. It stood empty, but its open doors and windows beckoned visitors, especially the young people of Bayfield, who would finally get inside to see what this long, mysterious building was all about. More than a few people who shared with me their stories of visiting the SAN spoke of it as rather spooky or eerie. Carrie Nowitzki blogged about the SAN on several occasions later. She wrote, "We were very much at that teenage where one is fascinated by creepy things like ghosts, vampires, and haunted houses, and we were convinced the SAN was absolutely haunted. Once inside an open window, we crept through the dark hallways, and any old noise inside the building made us run away screaming." I don't believe in ghosts, but when you look at that picture, what is that white light over? Run away indeed. Another curious space was a junk pile outdoors in the woods just off the grounds. She said, "We found all kinds of things, ranging from glass syringes to old bottles, tins, and even religious items. Again, nothing that we really wanted to have or keep, but just adding to the creepiness." Her pictures showing things just abandoned on the last day remind me of a friend who was a filmmaker. He was born in Janesville, as I was, where there was a General Motors plant that once employed more than 5,000 people. And a few years ago, the plant was closed down, and the city was decimated. So Bill decided he would do a film about the community and how it reacted to the loss of this facility and all of those great paying jobs. He gained access to the plant and got a walkthrough. And it was just striking to see the footage that he got. They had the robotic assemblers that were just standing in place. There were tools all around. And on the assembly line, there were the bodies of Chevy Suburbans, the big vehicles. They didn't have wheels or tires on them. There were no engines. The hoods were open. And it was just ghost-like because it's as if somebody pushed the button and stopped the assembly line and everybody walked away and that was it. And that's essentially what happened at the SAN. Carrie said one time she found a box of donuts on a table. And one of them was just a ring of green mold. Maybe the best account of a nighttime visit came from another woman named Bernice, who wrote about it in a blog post titled, "My Introduction to Bayfield." Bernice lived with her parents on a farm in central Wisconsin and had heard of our little town because her parents had come here on a couple of occasions because her father liked to dip his toes in Lake Superior. So at the time of her high school graduation in 1986, Bernice persuaded her parents to let her and 3 friends, Kim, Lisa, and Jean, take a camping trip to Bayfield. Her father said yes, and he would let her take his roomy Oldsmobile 88 for the journey. As Bernice put it, we loaded up that Olds and headed north for the biggest adventure of our 18-year-old lives. I don't recall the exact order of events, but it involved setting up our tents at a nearby campground, heading into town to eat and shop, meeting 4 boys from the area sitting on other people's yachts that these boys claimed to know, and sneaking around an old sanatorium one night, guided by their newfound friends. The old Bayfield welcome wagon at its best, I guess. The boys, being local and knowing the local scene, suggested we go check it out. At this point in the summer of 1986, the Pureair Sanatorium had been shut down for 11 years and was abandoned and falling down. Of course we were game to go see it. We again loaded up the Olds and headed out of town down some winding road. Once we arrived, the darkness had set in, and the whole place looked spooky, and it felt creepy. The building was long and broken down, like it was sinking into the earth. Guided by our friends and a few flashlights, we scampered down a small hill from the roadside to enter what may have been the first floor. Inside there was junk everywhere. Shattered glass, abandoned metal bed frames, and broken down doorways to small rooms. I'm sure the hair on the back of our necks was standing on end. We didn't go too far down the hallway when the ladies decided we had had enough and wanted to get out of there. Maybe it was a noise, maybe it was our imaginations, but we ran to the car at top speed like characters in a cartoon trying to escape. Once in the car, I took off down the road, first fishtailing, and then taking a corner so fast that a hubcap came off. But given I was driving my parents' car, I stopped and made everybody help find it. The trip was memorable and certainly the start of our changing lives. The sand continued to deteriorate, despite occasional grand plans for developing something there, until the extent of vandalism and looting of pieces in the building finally suggested that tearing it down was the only future that the sand could handle. Vandalism had intensified after the county sold the property to a private owner, and any useful material had been carted off. In 1986, Bayfield County Board Chair Tom Gordon said the site looked like a bombed-out village from World War II, and the county zoning director worried that as an attractive nuisance, it would almost invariably cause serious injury to trespassing visitors unless it was completely razed. And eventually it was, except for the superintendent's house, which still stands today. And if you'll note, it has some of the same architectural features as the sand itself. The wall that you see, that retaining wall, is still in place, kind of covered by snow last week when we were there. And the water tower, which at one time had that bucket on top, and now it's just the frame. So there's not much evidence of the sand's role in Bayfield life for more than 50 years, except for decades of memories that people have. Our friend Bernice, by the way, discovered when she arrived back at the farm that the hubcap had again fallen off somewhere. She told her parents she hadn't noticed, but said it must have happened when she drove over a railroad track. Years later, I would tell the truth, she wrote, to which my parents just said, yeah, we figured something happened in Bayfield. And that is Pureair Sanatorium, something else that happened in Bayfield more than 50 years ago, and is an important chapter in our ever-changing story. So if you should ever find yourself on Madeline Island next summer and wish to raise a glass to the sand and all who were part of it, you now know the appropriate place to do so. Thank you for listening. People have questions, or even better, if people have more personal memories than I could come up with and want to share them. Yes?
My grandmother was in there. She passed away in 1951 from TB. 3 months after she passed away, my mother got TB, and she was in that sand for almost 2 years.
Really?
At the age of 24.
It's hard to imagine. I mean, well, we went through COVID, and that was a terrible time as well. So you can sort of picture what a major disease or an outbreak is like, but just the idea of going away and staying someplace for 2 years to get well.
Right.
You know,
well, my mom said they posted like on their door when they did get it, big red sign, you know, that they had TB and no one could enter.
Yeah.
And then her mother went to the sanitarium. I
be...
still have things my mom made there when she
was that
was
right?
there.
That the occupational therapist got her in Belgium.
Yeah.
Yes.
I just briefly wanted to mention back in the 1950s, My mother had graduated from medical school and was one of the first female doctors actively practicing. For about 4 months in the Milwaukee area, she told the family she was going to be gone. And she went to a sanatorium in the Milwaukee area, and she just lived there completely for 4 months, working with the patients there. And the only effect it had on me was she obviously brought a little bit of it home, and I always checked out positive for TB. Get a chest X-ray every year because that was what was happening.
Sure. Those darn handkerchiefs.
For the time that she said she was going to be gone for a few months, and we just have to make it.
Right. Well, I think of the people that work there knowing the dangers involved in being exposed to that all the time. Credit to anybody who was involved, and many of you probably knew people or had people in your family who did work there. Yes, back there.
My great-great-grandmother that was at Sanitorium, and her family, they also did, she was there for several years, off and on. She was of Native American heritage. Is there any way, I mean, I have some pictures at home, so I have pictures of them, I have pictures of some of the nurses and things like that, but is there any, or are there any resources for who may have been a patient or anything like that, that should be able to, someone would be able to use for genealogy purposes?
I honestly don't know that. I didn't come across anything like that in the archives here. You might check with Tricia and talk to see about that. I don't know if the state would have any such records or not. I can't answer that, I'm afraid. Sorry. Yes?
I had a similar question. Any breakdown on Native American versus non-Native American?
I didn't see any such numbers.
And also, relatives cart the deceased away, or was there a cemetery on the grounds? Does anyone know?
There is not a cemetery on the grounds. No. Yes?
We just lived up the road from the sand, and my grandmother and my mom worked there. But I remember my grandmother worked in the laundry, and she did the big mangle,
Right.
and would run the sheets through it,
That's hard work.
and very hot in the summer.
Hot in the summer and cold in the winter, I'm sure. Yeah.
She had a room there, she'd stay there.
Yes.
We had a home in Bayfield.
Wow. Yes.
As a 4-H member, I remember going there and singing Christmas carols.
Yes. Yeah, groups would go out and do that. Now, did you have to wear masks or anything at that time, or
No, I don't believe so.
just keep a distance, maybe? Huh. Interesting. Yes.
I have a train schedule that shows that the trains stop at Pureair every day on the way up and back. Do you know whether they were dropping off patients or workers or, you know?
Probably both, but I thought at one point I saw that the train passed 4 times a day. So there was easy access from either Bayfield or Ashland. And that was one of the reasons that site was chosen. And that train tracks is now the Brownstone Trail, the walking trail. Yes?
Our mother here was a patient at the San. She was from Wakefield, Michigan.
Right.
And that was in the early 30s, maybe 32, 33. And at the time, she went to high school in Bayfield, and she graduated from Bayfield as a patient from the Sanatorium. Our grandmother also was a cook there, and our aunt worked there, and my grandmother took care of the movie's children during the years that they lived in the house there.
Right. It's interesting, the connections that people have still. And I'm really grateful that people like you showed up to help me out on this, because as I say, I didn't ever see it. So, Diane.
I'm not all that sure about the accuracy of the story, but
That doesn't stop us.
I remember talking, I don't know if it was Claire Flower Training or it was somebody has lived here a long time, I know who the cook was. And she said, people would stop and perform, performers were out here. She said the parents would stop there. And,
Really?
Yes, and he came, it was a surprise visit. And she cooked pork chops for him, and he really liked them.
Don't fact check that story. It's too good.
Dennis, who stopped?
Duke Ellington.
Oh,
He did make a movie over in the UP, Anatomy of a Murder, so he spent time up in the region. Anyway. Yes, you okay?
Just to confirm her story, I don't know about Duke Ellington, but I remember my great grandma, she remembers going to visit her mother she also said there was a lot of times, people that would come and perform there. So that's cooperative that part.
That's pretty cool. I think that people didn't just think of him as isolated and dangerous, but, still part of the community.
They used to give fireworks for neighborhood kids.
Yeah, they had an annual budget for fireworks, so that was an important part of it. And the name Pureair, by the way, is interesting because originally it was called the Tri-County Sanatorium. And at one time they came and tested the water, and the water was found to be exceptionally pure. So instead of calling it pure water, they started calling it Pureair because in the winter certainly there was pure air too. So that's how that name developed. But it was largely called the San by people because it's just shorter. Yes, in the back.
I worked with Pureair Sanatorium in the late 60s.
Okay.
And my job was payroll. And I all of the doctor's reports from the people that would come in, have their x-rays.
I did find some reports in the archives, and they're really helpful because they're contemporaneous accounts of what was, going on at that time. And it was just very helpful to be able to see the doctor's words. Some of those, maybe you typed those reports. Thank you.
I can remember them today just like it was yesterday.
Right.
Wonderful, wonderful parents. In my house, I have 2 wooden picture frames that were carved by a man at the sanatorium in the woodworking shop.
Mm-hmm.
And every frame, they're about this wide on each side, and flowers were engraved in those frames.
Well, they no doubt had the time to work on detail like that. So, yes.
2 questions actually. First is, I noticed that you didn't have a great deal of information after the 40s, 50s period. Do you intend to gather any more information about Pureair as time went by and
No.
were closed?
Once they started getting a handle on early detection, that's when patient numbers started to drop, and the cases became less severe, so there were fewer deaths. But I don't have a great deal more detail specifically by decade of how things changed.
Well, I hope some of the people who are telling you things and asking questions will remember to give the historical information to whoever they can to keep a record of it.
I think that BHA would welcome anything like that because they've got a good collection, and it would always be nice to add to it with personal accounts. Yes.
And my second question is, maybe I'm misinformed, but I thought TB was pretty much untreatable until antibiotics, but you're saying people were sent home cured.
The treatments they had were primitive, but they were able to get people out of there in 6 months to a year in many cases. But actually, TB is still around today. It's still a major respiratory killer in the world, especially in undeveloped and poorer countries. So, yeah, treatable, but you have to have the resources, first of all. So it's still around.
I have a question back here.
Yes.
I was a secretary at the Superior Staff from about 1968 till it closed.
Really? What was it like when it was winding down? Was there sadness or?
Oh, definitely. We all wanted it to be our Bayfield County nursing home.
There was talk about that for a long time.
And windows faced the lake.
Sure.
And bird feeders on every window.
And you would have probably closed them if you had a senior home there. But well, thank you very much. I appreciate everybody who offered. Oh, I'm sorry.
Another element that's still in existence from the sanatorium is the artesian well.
Yes.
And it's currently the water supply for the waterproof condos.
Right. Pure water. Well, thank you very much for coming out on a snowy day. Appreciate it.